Imagine you're just 12 years old. It's early morning. Cold mist covers the stone steps of a quiet monastery. Your bare feet feel frozen as you kneel silently. A monk walks toward you. His silk robe gently brushes the wooden floor with every step. You don't dare look into his eyes. You've already learned that much. He stands over you like a buyer inspecting something at the market. When he finally puts his hand on your shoulder, you feel something shift inside you. This is not just a touch. It's the start of a new life. A life filled with rituals, silence, and shame. You have become a chigu, a temple boy, but you don't yet understand what that really means. All you know is that something has changed forever. Thick incense fills the prayer hall, but it can't hide the smell of fear. In the dark corners between tall Buddha statues, other boys move quietly. Some have been here for months, others for years. Their faces are calm, but their eyes carry heavy secrets. Secrets you aren't ready to hear. Secrets about what happens when the temple bells stop ringing, and when the outside world forgets you exist. This is medieval Japan, a place where beauty had a price, and innocence could be bought by those with power. It was a world where religion and exploitation were so mixed together that people forgot where one ended and the other began. All that was left were the voices of boys lost too soon. But this story isn't just about one boy or one temple. It's about a system, a long, cruel system that lasted for hundreds of years, from mountain monasteries to grand samurai castles and city pleasure districts. This system trapped countless young boys, not by accident, but by design. In the temple at Mount Kyosen, dawn rises again. It's a morning just like so many others across the country. Young boys, some as young as 10, are being dressed and prepared. Their hair is shaved in a specific way. The small pieces that remain are brushed and styled to show off their youth. Their silk robes look beautiful, but they are really just soft chains. The world sees them as special, even holy. But inside the temple walls, they are no longer children. They are property. The tradition of using boys like this began in the 9th century. It was known as the system of the Chigu temple attendants who were supposed to learn religion. But in reality, many were chosen not for their minds, but for their beauty. Some parents, hungry and poor, sold their sons for money. They were told the boys would get an education. But behind that promise was something darker. Old temple records show how organized this system was. Monks would go to poor villages during times of famine. They offered to take the boys and give their families some money in return. Some parents believed this was a good future. Others knew the truth but had no other choice. Once a boy entered the temple, things changed fast. An older monk called a nanshoku would be assigned to him. He was supposed to guide the boy spiritually, but what followed was often abuse disguised as devotion. The monks said this bond between man and boy was sacred, but it wasn't. It was a system of control wrapped in religious language. Each day started before sunrise. The boys had to wake early to care for their assigned monk. They bathed him, dressed him, served his food. They were trained to move gracefully, speak softly, and obey without hesitation. Every action was watched, every mistake corrected. Slowly, the boys were shaped into something unnatural, quiet, obedient, and afraid. The worst part didn't come all at once. At first, it was disguised as spiritual lessons, closeness, touch, attention. But over time, the abuse became more obvious. Some monks used Buddhist texts to defend their actions, twisting ideas about compassion and love into something poisonous. Documents from temples like Inryakuji on Mount Hiei use strange, polite words. But when historians compare them with secret letters and diaries, the truth becomes clear. One monk from the 12th century wrote about a boy named Kikumaru. He described how he slowly trained him in what he called intimate teachings, claiming it was part of spiritual growth. The monasteries were often in remote areas. The boys had no way to contact their families or even understand what was being done to them. They were told their pain was holy, that they would be rewarded in the next life. Over time, many began to believe it. That was perhaps the most damaging part, the way they were taught to see their own suffering as necessary and good. Temples even had festivals to show off these relationships. They dressed the boys in special clothes and paraded them before crowds. These events turned abuse into ritual. Everything was made to look holy, but some boys tried to fight back. Secret punishment records show what happened when they did. Boys who said no to their monk were locked away, starved, or beaten. Some were scarred for life, both physically and emotionally. The punishments were recorded coldly. How many lashes, how many days without food, like it was just part of training. But it wasn't training. It was cruelty with a holy name. Some boys, broken by the system, began to compete for attention. They tried to outdo one another in obedience and submission, hoping to win favor. Some betrayed their fellow boys. The abuse didn't just come from above. It spread between them, poisoning everything. When a boy reached 14 or 15, his usefulness ended. His body changed. His voice deepened. He was no longer the silent, soft-looking child the monks desired. Some were kept as low-level monks forever. Damaged, others were simply thrown out, left to wander in a world they didn't know. A few ended up with the samurai. But things didn't get better. The samurai had adopted the same abusive system with even more violence. In military camps and castle towns, boys were taken in as apprentices, or so they were told. But they were really there to serve their lords in every way. These boys, called wakushek, were chosen even more harshly than the temple boys. Some were bought, some were traded. One letter from 1267 talks about a samurai trading 2 boys for a good horse. He described them like tools, obedient, trained, skilled in pleasure. The training mixed fighting with submission. Boys learned how to use swords and how to please their masters. The two were linked: pain, loyalty, and control. If a boy was good at both, he became a prized object, passed between samurai like a gift. Some records describe ceremonies to formalize these relationships. They were like contracts, signed and blessed, listing the boy's duties, including sexual ones. If the boy ran away or disobeyed, he could be scarred or even killed. The law supported this. At social events, lords would show off their boys. They were judged on beauty, skill, and obedience. There were even contests. Boys had to perform for guests. Winners got rewards. Losers were punished. The samurai didn't hide what they were doing. They took pride in it. Some Wakash tried to escape by running away or becoming monks, but they were often returned, punished again for causing trouble. A few survived and became samurai themselves, but many of them repeated the cycle, taking their own boys and continuing the abuse they had suffered by the Edo period. Beginning in 1603, the system moved into the cities. Now it was part of business. In pleasure districts like Yoshiwara in Edo, male prostitution became formalized. The boys were called kagima, shadow actors. They were treated like performers and products. They were sold to brothels and trained to entertain. Some were as young as 11. Their rooms were decorated to highlight their beauty. Incense, silk bedding, painted screens, all meant to attract paying customers. Older boys taught them how to act, talk, and please clients. The customers came from all parts of society: merchants, former samurai, even monks. Everyone knew where to go, and everyone knew what was really happening behind the painted doors. The boys were given contracts, often 10 years long, but most never earned enough to leave. They were kept hungry and weak, so they could be controlled. There were no doctors, no safety, no way out. A former Kagima named Kanuka wrote about his time in Osaka from 1687 to 1701. He said every day was filled with fear. Fear of angry clients, of disease, of getting older and being discarded. He wrote about boys who died from beatings or who took their own lives. These boys were told their suffering was noble, that they were giving pleasure, and that was a gift. Over time, many believed it. Some even took pride in surviving the worst of it, but when they finally got out, they had nowhere to go. No skills, no family, no hope. The lucky few opened brothels of their own and became part of the same system that had destroyed them. Even when officials tried to improve things, it was mostly for show. They cared more about taxes than about the boys. When brothel owners were caught being cruel, they were simply moved to another district. Foreign visitors in the 1850s began to write about what they saw. One British man, Rutherford Alcock, described the boys in the pleasure quarters and was shocked. He had seen prostitution in London, but this was something else organized, accepted, and ignored by the authorities. When Japan tried to modernize in the Meiji era, these practices began to fade, but not because people finally cared. It was because Japan didn't want to look bad in front of the Western world. Laws were passed, but little changed for the boys. This wasn't just personal cruelty. It was a system built to turn young lives into spiritual, military, or financial gain. The pain these boys suffered didn't end when the abuse stopped. It stayed in their minds. It changed how they saw themselves and others. It taught them to be ashamed, to be silent, to believe they were worth nothing. And the cycle kept going. Boys who survived often became the next abusers. It was all they knew. Some fought back. Some tried to escape, to warn others, to resist. Their stories, though, rare remind us that even in the darkest places, some light remained. It was a quiet afternoon in the year 1849. A British man named Edward Lane stood on the edge of a narrow street in Cairo, Egypt. He was not just any traveler. He was a scholar, a translator, and a man deeply curious about the cultures he visited. But what he saw that day shocked him. He noticed a group of young boys, their faces painted, wearing silk robes, and dancing slowly for a small crowd of older men. The boys looked no older than 12. They moved gracefully, like performers trained in some elegant art. But there was something else, something uncomfortable in how the men watched them. Edward wrote later in his diary that the boys reminded him of female dancers. He called them gilman, a term used for beautiful young boys who served and entertained in wealthy Muslim households. These boys, Edward realized, were not just dancers. They were trained companions. Their job was to entertain, sometimes through music, sometimes through poetry, and sometimes through something much darker in the world he had entered. These boys were valued not only for their talent, but also for their youth and beauty. And while it looked like tradition, Edward couldn't ignore what he felt in his gut. This was not just culture. It was something else, something deeply wrong. This practice was not new. It had been around for centuries. Across many parts of the Islamic world, from Persia to the Ottoman Empire to Mughal India, boys had been placed into roles that blurred the lines between art, service, and abuse. In the grand courts of ancient Baghdad, there were boys known as Amred. They were chosen for their smooth faces and young age. Grown men wrote poems about their beauty. These poems were recited in public, published in books, and passed from hand to hand. But they weren't just harmless words. They revealed a system, one that praised the physical charm of boys and turned it into something others felt entitled to use. Some poets said loving boys were spiritual, that their beauty reflected the divine. Others said it was safer than being with women. But in both cases, the boys themselves were silent. No one asked how they felt. No one cared what it did. To them, in the great palaces of the Ottoman Empire, things went even further. The sultans kept harems, hidden worlds behind locked doors. Most people know these harems were filled with women. But what they don't know is that some also included young boys. Eunuchs, boys castrated before puberty, were trained to serve, obey, and never speak out. These eunuchs were taken from their homes, often as children, and brought to the palace. There, they were cut off from the outside world. Their bodies were changed, their futures stolen, and all of it was done in the name of service, loyalty, and control. Some became powerful in the palace. They managed other servants. They moved freely between the Sultan and his advisors. But their power came at a cost. They were never allowed to love, marry, or have children. They had been turned into tools. In Mughal India, the Persian influence was strong. Poets and scholars brought with them the same romantic ideas about young boys. Paintings from the Mughal courts show noblemen lounging in gardens with boy attendants by their side. The boys poured wine, played music, and stayed close. In some stories, the boys are treated with care and affection. But many of these tales skip what happens behind closed doors. The boys had no power to say no. They were chosen, trained, and expected to serve. Even in places where Islam taught compassion and respect, these systems grew. Religious leaders often turned a blind eye. Some even justified the practice. They said as long as there was no physical act, it was not sinful. But others knew the truth. Writings from the time show concern. Some scholars warned about the dangers of falling in love with boys. They saw how easily power could be abused. In Damascus, a Sufi mystic named Al-Nawawi wrote about the pain caused when older men desired their students. He begged teachers to guard their hearts and their hands. He said the soul of a child was a trust, a sacred gift, not something to be broken. But not everyone listened. Travelers from Europe, like Edward Lane, often saw these practices and felt torn. On one hand, they were fascinated. On the other, they were disturbed. Some of them took part in the system themselves, then wrote about it with fake admiration. Others spoke out, but their voices were lost in the noise of cultural pride and religious defense. In the streets of Cairo, boys were sold not just to palaces, but to private homes and coffee houses. They became dancers, waiters, and sometimes sex workers. Their youth was their currency. But it didn't last long. By the time a boy reached 15 or 16, he was often discarded. His voice changed. His face grew hair. He was no longer desired. Many ended up on the streets, broken, abandoned, and ashamed. Some tried to rebuild their lives. A few opened their own coffee houses and trained younger boys, continuing the cycle. Others turned to crime or died young. Very few ever spoke about what happened to them. The shame was too heavy. There were no laws to protect these boys. In many places, what happened to them wasn't even seen as wrong. It was tradition, it was poetry, it was art. And so, it continued in modern times. People often say this was just a part of history, that the world was different back then. But if you look closely, the same patterns still exist today in different forms. In places where poverty meets power, children are still used, bought, and sold. The names change, the buildings look different, but the silence remains. Some countries have worked to end child exploitation. They have passed laws, built shelters, and trained police. But culture is harder to change than law. The old stories, the poems, the paintings, the quiet justifications still echo. In one 19th century Turkish diary, a wealthy man writes about the day he chose a boy named Hamid. He describes how the boy looked scared, how he tried to smile, how he was dressed in new clothes. The man says Hamid became more obedient with time. He never calls it abuse. He calls it love. But love doesn't steal childhood. Love doesn't take without asking. Love doesn't need silence to survive. We can't change the past, but we can tell the truth. We can speak for the ones who never had a voice, for the boys who were trained to please, to smile, to suffer in silence. Their stories were erased, painted over with gold and silk. It's time to strip away the decorations and look at what was really there, a system that hurt the most vulnerable, and called it culture. As the sun sets over the ancient cities of Cairo, Istanbul, and Delhi, their stones still remember. Not just the kings and scholars, but the boys, the ones who danced, who served, who disappeared. They were not legends. They were real, and they deserved better. In the deep silence of a Kyoto temple, an old man sat cross-legged, writing with calm hands. His name was Shinron. Once a temple boy himself, now an old monk with shaking fingers, he was writing something the world wasn't ready for. This wasn't just a story. It was a confession, a testimony, a memory soaked in pain, silence, and quiet courage. For many years, Shinron had served in the temple, obeying rules, wearing a smile, and staying silent. As a child, he had been chosen, praised for his beauty, his soft voice, his obedience. At first, he thought he was special, that being close to the monks was an honor. But soon, the truth revealed itself through unwanted touches, long nights, and a loneliness too big for his small heart. He kept his pain hidden for decades, locked away behind chants and rituals, until now, the world outside had changed. Survivors of temple abuse had begun to speak. Their voices, once whispers, were now rising in strength. And Shinron, now old, decided to add his own truth, not with anger, but with clarity. He did not want revenge, he wanted peace. For himself, and for all the children who had been broken by silence. His memoir did not name names. It did not shout. It did something harder. It spoke with honesty. He described how the temple system allowed abuse to grow quietly, secretly, without question. The robes of the monks hid more than just flesh. They hid crimes, generations of them, passed down, protected by tradition, fear, and blind obedience. Shinron wrote about the smiles he was forced to give, the sacred texts he was made to read while his mind was screaming. He wrote about how deeply he believed that what was happening to him was his fault, that maybe he was unworthy, sinful, not pure enough. Only later did he realize that the shame was never his to carry. When Shinran's memoir quietly reached a small printing house, the monks tried to stop its release, but it was too late. Copies were already being shared, passed hand to hand, and once people read it, they could no longer pretend not to know. The memoir struck a nerve. Former Chico, temple boys who had grown up and moved on, began coming forward. Some were now married with children, others were still struggling with what they had buried inside. One by one, their voices joined into something larger than grief. A small protest was held outside one of Kyoto's oldest temples. It wasn't loud, no shouting, just survivors holding signs that said, "We remember," and no more silence. Many of them wore white, the color of purity, the color that had been stolen from them, now reclaimed. The media tried to cover the movement carefully. Some news outlets ignored it. Others twisted it, calling it an attack on tradition. But the survivors didn't stop. One of them, a man named Kato, spoke on camera. He said, "When I was 12, I thought I had been chosen by God. Now I know I was chosen by a system that needed me to stay quiet." His words spread fast, and the silence that had protected the abuse for centuries began to crack. Temples were forced to respond. Some issued apologies carefully written, avoiding blame. Others denied everything. But a few brave monks stepped forward and admitted the truth. One of them, a middle-aged priest named Genjo, said in a televised statement, "We hid behind robes and rituals. We failed the children. We must change." And change began slowly, unevenly, but it began. New rules were introduced. Background checks, safe spaces, outside inspections. But more than that, people started talking. Parents began asking questions before sending their children to temple schools. Former victims were invited to speak at training sessions for young monks. The temple, once a place of secrets, was now trying to learn what honesty sounded like. Shinran did not live to see all this. He passed away just weeks after his memoir was published. But his ashes were not kept in the temple. They were scattered near a river where he used to sit as a boy, the only place he said he ever felt truly safe. In his final note, he wrote, "Let the river carry my name to the children who still wait to be heard." His words became a symbol, not just of pain, but of courage. Survivors across the country held small ceremonies by rivers, lighting candles for the ones who never got to speak for the first time. Temples in Japan were no longer just ancient walls and sacred chants. They became places of reckoning, of memory, of learning how to do better, and perhaps the most powerful change came from within. Young monks, now aware of this history, began asking different questions. Why had silence been seen as holy? Why had suffering been ignored? Why had boys like Shinran been left alone in their pain? Some of them chose to leave the path. Others stayed, hoping to build something new. But all of them carried the weight of knowing. The story of the Chigo is no longer hidden in old diaries or whispered in shadows. It lives now in books, in films, in open conversations. And though no apology can undo what was done, acknowledgement is a beginning. There are still many who look away, who say that was the past. But the survivors know that the past lives on in their bodies, their memories, and their silence. But now that silence is breaking, and in its place a new kind of chant is rising, one that says, "We were there, we were hurt, but we are still here."